I came to the floor today to oppose the nomination of Scott Pruitt to serve as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I want to thank my colleague from Delaware, who I had the honor to serve with when we were both governors, for his good work to point out why Scott Pruitt is the wrong person to head the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA was created by a Republican president in 1970, Richard Nixon. I remember very clearly when he did that. And across subsequent decades, support for this agency and for its important mission has been a strongly bipartisan endeavor. Our nation has benefited from the service of dedicated, highly effective EPA administrators from both parties. But I am deeply concerned that Scott Pruitt is a radical break from this bipartisan tradition. After reviewing Mr. Pruitt's environmental record, I have to ask, why was he nominated for this critically important position? He rejects the core missions of the Environmental Protection Agency. At every turn, he sued the EPA to block protections for clean air and clean water. He's an outspoken climate change denier. He seeks to dismantle the EPA's Clean Power Plan, which was put in place to address climate change. And he opposes other efforts to slow the warming of this planet. Time and again, he has put private interests and their profits ahead of the public interest and public health. As Attorney General of Oklahoma, he sided with oil and gas companies, and he's failed to protect the people of his state from some of the worst impacts of hydraulic fracturing. He's taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions from fossil fuel industries, and he's zealously advocated for their freedom to pollute our air and water. So, again, I ask, why was Scott Pruitt nominated to serve as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency? Well, I think it's clear that Mr. Pruitt was nominated not to lead the EPA forward, but to prevent it from carrying out its mission. And make no mistake, Mr. Pruitt and his extreme agenda are a threat to the environment, to the planet, and to our public health. Christine Todd Whitman, who is a former Republican governor of New Jersey and who I also had the honor of serving with when I was governor, Senator Carper and Christy Whitman and I all served as governors together. She also was EPA administrator during George W. Bush's administration. And what she said about Pruitt, I think, is worth listening to. This is a Republican talking about Scott Pruitt. And I quote, she says, "I don't recall ever having seen an appointment of someone who is so disdainful of the agency and the science behind what the agency does," end quote. Well, people in the state of New Hampshire have no doubt about the reality of climate change. In the Granite State, we see it, we experience it all the time. The steady increase in yearly temperatures and the rise in annual precipitation are already affecting New Hampshire's tourism and our outdoor recreation economy, which accounts for more than $4 billion a year and employs over 50,000 people. Each year, hundreds of thousands of sportsmen and wildlife watchers come to New Hampshire to enjoy our beautiful mountains, our lakes, our other natural resources, our 18 miles of coastline, which we're very proud of. And hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation contribute more than $4 billion, as I said, to New Hampshire's economy each year. But much of this is now threatened by the warming of our planet. Rising temperatures are shortening our fall foliage season. They're negatively affecting our snow and ice-related winter recreation activities, including skiing, snowboarding, and snowmobiling. An estimated 17,000 Granite Staters are directly employed by the ski industry in New Hampshire, and the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services warns that those jobs are threatened by climate change. And likewise, New Hampshire and indeed all of New England's brilliant fall foliage is at risk. I want to quote from a report by New Hampshire Citizens for a Responsible Energy Policy. They say current modeling forecasts predict that maple sugar trees eventually will be completely eliminated as a regionally important species in the northeastern United States. Climate modeling by the Union of Concerned Scientists projects that by the end of this century, New Hampshire summers will feel like present-day summers in North Carolina, 700 miles to our south. And we've got a map here that shows what's going to happen to our red maples and the maple sugaring industry. So we can see everything here that's in red. These are all those sugar maples. And projected by 2070 or 2100, they're gone. They're gone from New England, from the Northeast, and for most of the eastern part of this country. If we fail to act on climate change, this could mean a steep loss of jobs. It could mean a loss of revenue. It will destroy our maple sugaring industry, and it will damage our outdoor recreation industry. Maple sugar production is entirely dependent on weather conditions, and changes, no matter how modest, can throw off production and endanger this industry. Maple trees require warm days and freezing nights to create the optimal sugar content and sap production. The changing climate is putting more and more stress on sugar maples, and as this map shows so well, it's already significantly affecting syrup production. If we fail to act on climate change, this could destroy our maple syrup industry. And if you haven't done maple sugaring in the springtime, there is nothing like maple syrup over snow. There is nothing else like it. And to lose that, to lose the jobs that are there, is a real change to one of the recreational activities that we love in New Hampshire. Climate change is also threatening our wildlife species and their habitats. The moose is an iconic feature of New Hampshire's culture and identity, but as the results of climate change, we have seen a 40% decline in New Hampshire's moose population, and you can see really clearly from these pictures why we're losing our moose. Because of milder winters, ticks don't die off, and it's really very tragic. The ticks multiply on a moose, they ravage it, and they eventually kill it. And I don't know if people can see, but those look like little balls on the end of that moose's tail. Those are ticks. This moose probably has brain worm, which is another problem that the moose have because of winters that aren't cold enough to kill off those parasites. Ticks multiply on a moose, they ravage it, and they eventually kill it. We've seen modeling from the University of New Hampshire that suggests that by 2030, moose will be gone from not only from northern New Hampshire, but from much of the northern part of this country. Other newly invasive insects are harming wildlife species as well as trees. And of course, people are also suffering from the impacts of climate change. Rising temperatures increase the number of air pollution action days. They increase pollen and mold levels outdoors as well as allergen levels inside. And all of these things are dangerous to sensitive populations with asthma, allergies, and chronic respiratory conditions. In fact, New Hampshire has one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country because we are the tailpipe. All of New England is the tailpipe for the rest of the country. Pollution blows across this country from the Midwest, and it exits through New Hampshire and New England. And rising temperatures facilitate the spread of insect-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease. We could see on that moose what the impact is. Let's put the moose back up there. Well, those ticks aren't just multiplying on the moose, they're multiplying in a way that affects people as well. And fortunately, because we've seen the impact of climate change, New Hampshire and the other New England states are taking the lead in reducing carbon emissions and transitioning to a more energy-efficient, clean energy economy. We are one of 9 northeastern states that are participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, called RGGI. It's essentially a cap-and-trade system in the Northeast. New Hampshire has already reduced its power sector carbon pollution by 49% since 2008. That's a 49% reduction in less than a decade. And thanks to efforts by state and local communities, New Hampshire is on track to meet the Clean Power Plan's carbon reduction goals 10 years early. In addition, we're using proceeds from emissions permits sold at RGGI auctions to finance clean energy and energy efficiency investments. Well, unfortunately, Scott Pruitt seems to believe that reducing pollution and investing in a clean environment are somehow bad for the economy. Well, he's just wrong about that. Our efforts in New Hampshire and across New England to fight climate change and promote clean energy have been a major boost to economic growth. We've seen jobs added as a result. During its first 3 years, RGGI produced $1.6 billion in net economic value and created more than 16,000 jobs in our region. Nationwide, employment in the fossil fuel sector is falling dramatically, but job creation in the clean energy and energy efficiency sectors is exploding. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, more than 2 million jobs have been created in the energy efficiency sector alone. And if we could ever get Congress to move the energy efficiency legislation that Senator Portman and I have introduced, would create, by 2030, another 200,000 jobs just on energy efficiency. Across New England, we're demonstrating that smart energy choices can benefit the environment and strengthen job creation and the economy overall. So again, we have to ask, why does Scott Pruitt deny the science of climate change? Why has he urged states to refuse to comply with the Clean Power Plan? Why has he filed lawsuit after lawsuit to block enforcement of the Clean Air Act? Why does he deny something as nearly universally recognized as the dangers of mercury pollution? The bottom line, I believe, is that Scott Pruitt is first and foremost a fierce defender of the oil and gas industry. If scientists point to carbon emissions as the main cause of climate change, then he has to deny that science. If science and common sense point to hydraulic fracking as the cause of thousands of earthquakes in the state of Oklahoma, then he must deny that too. If the EPA's mission is to protect clean air and clean water from pollution caused by fossil fuels, then he has to sue the EPA and try to cripple it. Well, Scott Pruitt's nomination is not about shaking things up in Washington. It's about turning over control of the EPA to the fossil fuel industry and turning back the clock on half a century of bipartisan efforts in Democratic and Republican administrations alike to protect clean air and clean water and to pass on to our children a livable environment and an earth that they can inhabit for future generations. Mr. President, my office has been flooded with calls, with emails and letters from Granite Staters. They not only oppose Mr. Pruitt's nomination, they are genuinely afraid of the consequences of putting him in charge of the EPA. I heard from Deb Smith from Hampton, New Hampshire. That's a small community on our coastline. She wrote that, quote, "I'm a birder, love to walk on the beach and in the mountains, and rely on time spent in nature to cope with a lung cancer diagnosis. Clean air is especially important to me." Pruitt's long history of suing the EPA and reversing decades of progress in improving the environment disqualifies him from this post, she writes. "It's essential to continue to preserve and improve our natural environment for people, birds, and other wildlife." End quote. Elizabeth Garlow of Concord writes, "New Hampshire, due to quirks in its geology and the Earth's rotation, is the tailpipe of the nation, with much of the air pollutants from the Midwest exiting to the ocean from here. The people of New Hampshire cannot sit back and watch our children suffer from asthma and be restricted from outside activities due to bad air quality days. Mr. Pruitt will be a very significant detriment to the quality of life in New Hampshire, end quote. And Eugene Harrington of Nashua writes, I'm against the appointment of Scott Pruitt to head the EPA. He does not seem to support the purpose of the EPA. Now I hear that even scientific papers are being reviewed to be sure they support the current administration's view of facts. And he has facts in quotes. Please do what you can to support a functioning EPA. Christopher Morgan of Amherst, New Hampshire writes, this is my first message I have ever sent to my senator in my 32 years as a voting American. As a registered Republican, I am vehemently opposed to Mr. Pruitt leading the EPA. He has consistently shown he does not believe in the threat posed by climate change. Climate change affects every citizen in this country and has a detrimental effect on the New Hampshire climate specifically. President Trump's willful disregard for the safety and protection of all Americans cannot go unchecked, end quote. Let me emphasize that I've heard from many Republican constituents who oppose Scott Pruitt's confirmation. My Republican friends point with pride to the fact that the EPA was created by a Republican president. After all, what could be more conservative than conserving our environment and preserving a livable earth for future generations? For nearly half a century, protecting the environment has been a bipartisan priority and endeavor. That's especially true in the state of New Hampshire, where folks understand that clean air and water and fighting climate change are not and should not be partisan issues. We all have a profound stake in protecting the environment. Unfortunately, with the nomination of Scott Pruitt to head the EPA, the Trump administration is willing to shatter this bipartisan tradition and consensus, and we must not allow this to happen. I appeal to all of my colleagues, but especially to all of those on the other side of the aisle. Don't allow this nominee to destroy your party's hard-earned reputation as a champion of common sense efforts to protect clean air, clean water, and a sustainable earth. I urge us to come together, senators on both sides of the aisle, to reject this effort to undo nearly 5 decades of bipartisan efforts to protect our environment and our planet. The stakes are incredibly high for all of us. By rejecting this unsuitable nominee, we can reconsider our approach to the EPA. We can embrace this nation's bipartisan commitment to protecting the environment for future generations. This is what the great majority of Americans want us to do. Let's listen to their voices, and let's say no to this nominee, Scott Pruitt, who is not only not qualified for this position, he is not committed to the EPA and its mission.